And welcome to our first CPC3 lecture of the 2021-2022 academic year. I'm your host for this evening, Scott Roy, and I'm the Director of Development for the college, and it's my pleasure to be with you this evening. These lectures are intended to help each of us delve a little deeper into the areas of theology, tradition, and our times, which incidentally constitute the three-dimensional nature of the CPC3 lectures. Tonight, it's my privilege to introduce our first lecturer of the year, CPC's very own academic dean and assistant professor of theology, Dr. Andrew Koetler. As many of you know, Dr. Catler is at home here at Trinity Western, his alma mater, where he earned both his undergraduate and master's degrees. His doctoral work was completed at St. Andrews, Scotland, dealing with the notion of the human person and time in the works of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger and Alexander Schmemann. He's contributed to academic journals such as Modern Theology and the Pontifical Academy of Theology, and is currently awaiting the publication of an edited volume titled Mapping the Una Sancta. Most importantly, in 2018, he helped lead the profs to a 407 to 308 point victory over the students in the annual Bowling with the Profs event. And I will present him again with that award just so you can all see it. I want to introduce the topic tonight by way of introducing CPC's promise or goal to families and students and the 5 ways or methods we use to achieve that promise. We promise to provide a formation to engage our times fearlessly and faithfully. The 5 ways by which we move towards this goal are through 1, engaging the Catholic intellectual tradition. Number 2, by seeing Christ in the world. Number 3, by becoming living icons. Number 4, dialoguing toward truth. And number 5, by being a culture, by being an environment of relationship. Now, Dr. Koetler's lecture is a kind of roadmap which will bring us through the realms of idols, which typically steal our hearts from God, and icons, which point us past themselves toward God, so that by the end, we will look at the world, as point number 2 is, by seeing Christ in the world which was created good, and we will be able to have a better view of Christ in it. So, as a famous YouTube troupe once quipped, it is not my honor, but it is certainly my duty to introduce my good friend, Dr. Andrew Koetler. Let's give him a warm welcome. Yes, thank you.
I challenge you to try and take this from us. I just put that out there. All right, thank you, Scott. You left your notes too, and that was a better summation of my paper than my paper is. So, put that there. Okay, stealing an image that, isn't this the image you provided in the poster? Scott not only is writing how my paper is going to be, but he gives an image of what it's to look like too. So there it is. Yeah, it's great to see you all here. Most of you I know, or all of you. But this is exciting to have such a good turnout for our first CPC3 lecture. Okay, so from idol to icon, learning to see through the body. Arguably, the human individual and its concomitant, the human body, are idols of secularism. There's a certain irony, perhaps an irony shared with all idols, that such idolatry is so close and yet so far. Just adjust this. So close yet so far from true Christian worship. C.S. Lewis notes that if we could see our neighbor for who he will one day be, we would be tempted to worship him. That is, next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. You don't have that. There it is. To your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way. For in him also, Christ, vere latitat, and our Latinist over here, or burgeoning Latinist, will tell me I pronounced that wrong. The glorifier and the glorified, glory himself is truly hidden. Following Lewis's direction, we could say that idols and icons are closely related. If this is truly the case, then confronting the idols of secularism may involve reconception rather than replacement. Perhaps it's important to lay out one's cards before one begins. Perhaps a bad poker strategy, but, maybe it's good for theological discourse. There's a growing divide within the church that sadly mimics present-day politics. One identifies as a Catholic on the right, or takes the opposing view and identifies with the left, conservative Catholic versus liberal Catholic. And, we can kind of paint these in broad brushstrokes. The liberals take up the post-Vatican II spirit of discontinuity, while the conservatives increasingly move in a reactionary, perhaps anti-Vatican II direction. Balthasar, great theologian of the 20th century, refers to this as the destructive dispute between the mindless left and the ossified and embittered right. Liberal Catholicism is mystifying. To purposely stand on the periphery when there's a well-defined center, teachings of the church, certainly this cannot be doctrinally motivated. It's the so-called conservative Catholics, by the way, you should just take out the name before, just, Catholics, this sort of descriptive term I think is deeply problematic, but we know what I'm talking about. Conservative Catholics is generally who I have in mind with this paper, for they're not trying to stand on some sort of traditionalist periphery, but I assume they're aiming toward a faithful center. My concern, however, is that out of fear and in reaction to the present dominant secular ideologies, such faithful Catholics will become the ossified and embittered right. Liturgical rubric watchdogs, heresy hunters, entrenched traditionalists who stand athwart modern culture. Such posturing does not bide well with the church's new evangelization. Now, there's always been a tension in the church, a Chestertonian red and white, never a pink, in which we have the St. Justin martyrs and the St. Benedicts, those who see the seeds of the Logos in the surrounding culture and actively go out beyond the walls of the church, and those who cloister to protect the faith. There's need for both. St. Augustine insightfully summarizes this dual need to affirm and negate. A person who is good, and a true Christian, he says, should realize that truth belongs to his Lord, wherever it is found, gathering and acknowledging it even in pagan literature. But rejecting superstitious vanities and deploring and avoiding those who, though they knew God, did not glorify him as God or give thanks, but became enfeebled in their own thoughts and plunged their senseless minds into darkness. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for the image of corruptible mortals and animals and reptiles. This lecture is coming from the former Justinian approach, hoping to balance out the latter approach, and thereby echoing St. Augustine's conclusion that holds these two together. So, the tenor of this talk is hopeful. It imbibes and works within St. John Paul II's famous biblical pronouncement, "Be not afraid." But, in all honesty, it is often out of great concern or even trepidation of the idols of the age that I hold tightly to St. John Paul II's biblical dictum. I'm used to just calling him JP2. It's simpler. But, as the scholar David Fagerberg wisely wrote, to fear something other than God is idolatry. There are many circumstances where we must say no to the idolatrous culture of our age. But, as Bishop Robert Barron repeatedly insists, we should emphasize that our no is always in response to the no given by secular culture. In other words, our no is a rejection of a negation and is therefore affirmation. With this affirmative approach, I want to think through how idolatry of the body can be reconceived as a step in the right direction, leading away from idolatry of the self, and how the body as an idol can be transformed into an icon. In particular, it will explore how male and female difference, or otherness, can be a catalyst for such an iconic transformation. Quick side note. So, in a way, maybe I'm inspired by Dr. Baird when he gave his last talk, and it was kind of an experiment. This is kind of a bit of an experiment, a sort of model to think through how we can engage in the world around us. So, my goal in this paper is to provide perhaps a little bit of inspiration, perhaps some impetus, and perhaps a very vague methodology for how we can evangelize. As a paper, it's incomplete. Partly because of time, but it needs more. I need to talk about theology of mediation, which is so important. I need to talk about creation. I need to talk about eschatology, but I won't have a chance to do that. Nevertheless, I hope that this is still helpful. Okay, so here we go. The context of idolatry. The religious sense that is innate to the human person directs her toward worship. The Orthodox liturgical theologian, who I love to quote, Alexander Schmemann, acutely wrote that before all else, man is homo adorans. He's a worshiping being. G.K. Chesterton poetically quipped, if man cannot pray, he is gagged. If he cannot kneel, he is in irons. While the human person is a worshiping creature, a creature who cannot help but to worship, she is also, arguably, a semiotic creature who lives by signs and creates signs, art being a great example. Both of these, worship and signs, participate in reality and are reality. Worship is intimately connected with the recognition of God as creator and is the right response to the reality of creation. For creation, including our own creatureliness, is the result of the overflow of God's superfluous love. Creation is a gift. The correct response, of course, to a gift is gratitude, and in this case, Eucharistic worship. Creation is a gift, and when we look closely, we can see that it's symbolic. It declares the glory of God. Reality is a sign. Thus, the human person, who is arguably a seeing creature, looks to the things of this world to make sense of reality. As worshiping semiotic creatures, it is easy to see why we slip so easily into idolatry. It is, in a way, put this loosely, natural. That is, idolatry is fallen man's erroneous attempt to engage with the world, the symbols of creation. In St. Paul's language, idolatry is an exchange of reality. As fallen creatures, we interpret reality askew, replacing God as the subject and object of worship with something we comprehend. Luigi Giussani states that, quote, "This is original sin, the claim of being able to identify the total meaning with something comprehensible." To add to this, not only does fallen man misapprehend the one he is supposed to worship, but he also, without divine guidance, worships incorrectly, and thereby, interestingly, succumbs to the same problem. Joseph Ratzinger writes that liturgy cannot spring, this is a quote, liturgy cannot spring from imagination, our own creativity. Then it would remain just a cry in the dark or mere self-affirmation. We can see then that ill-formed worship leads to a type of narcissism, to a primacy of the self. Likewise, identifying meaning with what you understand as Giussani highlights, is to make yourself the arbiter of reality. Here, the individual controls and decides what is ultimate. He becomes judge and jury. Self-led worship, which inherently concerns the comprehensible, is both a reflection and an affirmation, in the negative sense, of the self. Giussani insightfully notes that if the human being claims to define the total meaning, he can only end up exalting his own point of view, one point of view. He cannot avoid claiming totality for a particular, inflating a detail to define the whole. Inevitably, this leads to a clash. The point of view held by each person smashes against that of his mirrored monadic neighbor. Thomas Hobbes's The War of Every Man Against Every Man. Hence, idolatry, reflection and affirmation of the self, is the root of violence. Coming at this from a different angle, Hans Urs von Balthasar argues that without grounding my freedom in God and recognizing my freedom is indebted to someone other than me, the degree of give and take and self-surrender on the part of each is limited and calculated. Either intersubjectivity is seen as a secondary and obscure mode of the one sovereign subject, or else the subjects remain monads, impenetrable to one another. Okay, and he's playing with Leibniz, has this idea of monads, and these, that the monads, there's no interpenetration, and there's this sort of idea of like a rampant individualism where no person touches into the other person. And when somebody with a name like Hans Urs von Balthasar says something, you probably should listen, right? I'm a little bit jealous, but Andrew Koetler doesn't quite work. But I had the initials there, right? The TJ, which sort of adds a little class to it, you think? But actually the real reason for that is that I have a doppelganger named Andrew Koetler, who's a theologian, also Mennonite background. And he contacted me once, and we had all these weird connections. Like I did all this graduate work on a guy named George Grant, and he's like, my favorite philosopher is George Grant. So anyway, at first I thought, this is great. I can steal his name. He's a little older than me. I can kind of use his CV to get jobs. And then when I became Catholic, I realized I don't really want to be confused with the Mennonite theologians. So now I insert my initials. There we go. That has nothing to do with the talk. Okay. Okay. Locked within the imminent horizon of idolatry, one is closed off to the other. No wonder the writers of the Old Testament repeatedly rail against idolatry. There can be no shalom, no peace, no harmony in the midst of idolatry. So, speaking of the Old Testament, let's turn to the story of the golden calf in the book of Exodus. And Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tables of the testimony in his hands, tables that were written on both sides. On the one side and on the other were they written. And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, graven upon the tables. And as soon as he came near the camp, and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tables out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. So, interpreting this theologically, note how the tables were written on both sides. That is, they were complete, they were whole. The commandments present to us moral reality in its complete form, a type of wholeness. Written into stone, the 10 Commandments reveal the unchanging, permanent grain of the universe. Upon seeing his people in the act of idolatry, Moses throws the tables and breaks them at the foot of the mountain. With some creative spiritual interpretation, we could say Moses' act of angry violence mirrors the reality of what the Israelites had done. In their idolatry, the Israelites were effectively throwing reality back against God, denying it, smashing it. And this reiterates what I set out earlier. Misplaced worship is a violation, even a rejection of reality. Giussani and Balthasar highlight that idolatry is a curving inward to the self. And in the book, and St. Augustine defines sin in this way, interestingly. And in the book of Exodus, we can see that idolatry is misperception about reality. With these two notions of idolatry kept in mind, idolatry as curving inward and idolatry as misperception about reality, let's examine the worship of self, specifically a disembodied sense of self, the worship of self that excludes the body. Oh, classic, right? I always have to miss one line in class. Here we go. Okay. But I provide pictures for those students that don't like to read. In The Christian Mystery, Louis Bouillet provides an insightful statement about the idolatrous danger of retreating from external reality. He writes, "At first ecstasy, the flight from the world into a pure interiority, might seem safer. It is, however, laden with still more formidable dangers if we suppose that the worst idolatry is that of the first fallen angel, the idolatry of oneself. For in any other there remains the certainty that God is different. God is different. And an apparent salvation found in a detachment in which only the self remains is dangerously close to the most radical idolatry for which there is no cure." Great quote. God is different. God is other. God is absolute. He is the absolute other. In liturgical terms, if what we think does not produce awe in us, it is not God we are thinking. This is arguably the most demanding aspect of reality to accept. What Schmemann wisely noted about the Lord's Prayer, that difficult part when we say, "Not my will, but thy will, thy kingdom come." The emphasis on thy, not my. It's not my kingdom. We struggle enough with the recognition of the human other as an other, let alone recognizing the divine other, God himself. To fully embrace this line of the Lord's Prayer, there must be a death of self and a radical Marian reposturing, a reorientation that overcomes idolatry. Joelle, you didn't want the seat of honor? No? Okay. This way of being or posturing is to align with reality, to move with the grain of the universe. Redemption does not save us from our humanness, but saves our humanness. Pope Benedict XVI wrote, "The human being is made for gift, which expresses and makes present his transcendent dimension. Sometimes modern man is wrongly convinced that he is the sole author of himself, his life, and society. This is a presumption that follows from being selfishly closed in upon himself, and it is a consequence, to express it in faith terms, of original sin." So, can there be a disembodied sense of self that is not turned inward, that is not selfishly closed in upon itself? Well, the answer to the rhetorical question is no. There cannot be. For it's through the body that we communicate. The body is both that which separates us from each other. I'm not Scott. Scott's not me. Right now he's thanking the Lord for that. My body is not your body. And what brings us together, verbal speech, body language, touch, etc., it is the body then that reveals to us that we're made for a gift, or made for gift. And I'll come back to this. The secular narrative of individualism, along with its concomitant hot-button issues, such as transgenderism and gender feminism, what I mean by that is gender differences are conceived as a social construct, they involve a recognition of self that is disconnected from bodily existence. And here we encounter the almighty I. I will decide. Who are you to tell me who I should be? It is my life. Each individual is a king or queen imprisoned within his or her own individual tower. This narrative is the epitome of what we could call negative freedom. No barriers or boundaries equals freedom. In the case of transgender or gender feminist ideology, the natural body is seen as a barrier to be overturned in the name of freedom. Freedom in this situation is identified with desire. Antonio Malo, prof at the JP2 Institute for Marriage and Family in Rome, highlighting the problem with the LGBTQ plus movement, writes, quote, "If sexuality becomes personal for the simple reason that it is free, and it is free when it chooses without external pressure, it seems that in order to have a personal sexuality, it is enough to choose in accordance with one's own tastes, inclinations, and preferences, since these, according to these writers, reflect what is deepest in the person, one's own desires." The relation to rampant individualism and negative freedom, and as we see here, is all but obvious. Inherent to such individualism is a type of Gnosticism or Manichaeism, a rejection of the body. For the body, by its very nature, undermines radical individualism. The body is undeniably contingent and relational. Even at just the base level, the embodied creature needs nourishment and therefore depends upon others in all stages of life. Of course, babies being the most obvious, but then also the end of life being another experience where we depend on the other. It should be no surprise that along with gender ideologies, the legalization of abortion and euthanasia have arisen in Western society, the home of disembodied individualism. Okay, so now let's turn to worship of the body. I was able to make it into the Trinity Western Gym last week and caught Mark working out, and I captured this picture of him admiring his biceps. Thank you, Mark, for letting me post the picture. The dominant narratives found within secular postmodernity are anything but coherent. On one hand, broadly speaking, the West has taken up the narrative of radical individualism and rejected the body. On the other hand, it's totally obsessed with the body, as evidenced by fitness frenzy culture, the plethora of drastic diets, paleo, keto, carnivore, the pathological yearning for youth, and, in particular, the excessive sexualization of society. As disconnected as these two narratives appear, there is a thread that links the postmodern rejection of the body with its apparent opposite, the worship of the body. But to make sense of this, we need to turn to something I like to talk about a lot, Trinitarian theology. So, this is like 2.5 minutes of what we do in Rels 105. Here we go. Yeah. And we're not there yet. We'll get there in 105. Okay, so theologically speaking, we know that the human person was made from relation, Trinitarian, superfluous love, and for relation, theosis, divinization, deification, whatever term you would like. We are beings with the other, and beings for the other. There is no I without a thou, nor without a we. And again, for the Scottish people, I don't mean like the we, the little things, or for you video game people, that we thing that you play, right? We, W-E. I don't even have it up there, so don't get confused. W-E. Redemption restores the relationality of the human person, or to put it differently, redemption restores our personhood. Christianity is a religion of the person. We worship a triune God, una substantia tres personae, and not, as one of my students once said, tuna substantia tres personae. I had to let him know it had nothing to do with fishing. But so a perfect communion of persons, one being, three persons. Trinitarian doctrine reveals to us that personhood is relational, and thus, by being drawn into the Trinitarian life, we become infinitely, in a creaturely sense, relational, and therefore we become persons to the nth degree. This is what we are made for. As gift, we are only true to our ontic selves, to our deepest self, if we step beyond ourselves by gifting ourselves to the other, and ultimately to the divine other. The other half of the reciprocal equation is that we must receive the other as gift. And in this manner, we image Jesus Christ, who's absolutely from the Father and absolutely for the Father. Whatever the Father has, he gives to the Son, and the Son gives it all back. The human person naturally intuits, I'm one ahead of myself. The human person naturally intuits her relationality, consciously or unconsciously. All humans, status viatoris, beings on the way, are striving toward the fulfillment of personhood, relationality. I think we can all attest to this with this whole COVID thing and isolation and all that, and how that's been so detrimental to people mentally. We are beings that need to be in relation. This connatural recognition of relationality drives us toward bodily existence. With disembodied individualism, one moves against his very being. Thus, existentially pricked, prodded, and poked, the human person is driven outward to the idolatry of the body. Or to put it differently, starving for the otherness of relationality, the disembodied individualist ravenously turns to the closest and most natural thing in its proximity to satiate its hunger, namely the body of the other sex. And, as Bouillet points out, this exterior idolatry is a less destructive form of idolatry than an idolatry of pure interiority. With the idolatry of the body, specifically idolatry of the other sex, contingency and difference is encountered even if it is often overlooked. And just to be clear, I'm using JP2's language of the other sex. He thought it was an incorrect way to talk about male and female, to refer to them as the opposite sex. And he wrote a whole bunch of pages about that in his Theology of the Body. Okay. The idolatry of the body can be a stepping stone away from idolatry to true worship, but only if it actually leads one to encounter the other. But how do we encounter the other? Somehow, we must move away from seeing the other as object. I want to be like him, fitness culture, or I want her, hookup culture. We need to move past that to seeing the other as person. We must move from desire to love. And by desire, I mean the natural sexual drive. What JP2 talks about is the biological, not simply the biological, but the existential, both of those. Desire tends toward objectification and utility, whereas love, argues Karol Wojtyła, is the opposite of using. Why? Because love is based on a common good, which requires a common end. This shared bond is both external and internal, and it makes both persons equal, for both are subordinated to the good. Wojtyła maintains, and Wojtyła, that's pre-JP2, right? It's before he's Pope. Wojtyła maintains that the human person has a natural propensity and capacity for love, but this does not arise from instinct, but from free will. That is, the human person has the freedom to subordinate himself for the good of the other. He can will the good of the other for the other. Only persons can love. However, this will not arise naturally. One must choose this way. And only love can liberate us from a utilitarian ethic, from turning everything into consumption. Nevertheless, In the love relationship between a man and a woman, love is not simply reasoned and ordered to an end, but is in conjunction with the sexual drive. The sexual drive, when not disordered, indicates a direction to a person of the other sex. I remember hearing a lecture by the natural law philosopher J. Bud Zizuski, and he said that if there wasn't the sex drive, we'd have a real problem. The male would never overcome his fear of the female, and vice versa, and we'd still be living on like a grade 1 playground, running away from each other. The sex drive assists us in overcoming the strangeness of the other. If there was no sex drive, men and women, would still be, oh my, you're different than me. Now, this may overstate the case. Nevertheless, it says something important about natural desire, or sex drive, and otherness. Out of the natural desire for the other sex arises the possibility of spousal love. That is, the possibility of love arises because the natural desire is directed toward what? A particular person. Not an idea, but a concrete human person. And love characterizes the realm of persons. Nevertheless, love is different than the sexual drive. While the sex drive is natural and occurs without the will, love is an act of the will. The sexual drive provides material for our actions, but the drive is dependent on what the person does with it. What I want to emphasize is that the sexual drive can be seen as a first step that pushes us toward otherness. Livio Molina writes, "The affective dynamic, which is rooted in our physicality and is at the origin of human action, is a call to open up to others, even a call to self-giving, to accept others and come out of solitude. The idolization of the body of the other sex points toward otherness, albeit in perhaps a confused manner. From the recognition of the other sex as other, one is often led to the initial romantic stages of love. As both Joseph Pieper and Chesterton like to say, it is in this stage of love that the lover and the beloved naturally make promises of total commitment. Right? I mean, that's all love poetry, and if you can remember back, those of us who've been married for a long time remember those initial days of dating. You're like promising the world, It's just natural. It's what we do. These promises make us persons, for a promise is an intersubjective reality. A promise is inherently a promise to someone. We do not make promises to ice cream cones or blue marbles. I've almost made promises to cappuccinos before, but not quite. Promises personalize the promiser and the one who receives the promise. The one who gives the promise has been open to the other and is open to a greater extent than the simple recognition of the other sex as other. He's entered into the moral realm by desiring and upholding the good of his beloved, fidelity. Likewise, the one who receives the promise is acknowledged as a person, as another who's owed fidelity. Is this not an inchoate transformation from idol to icon? The apogee of love between the sexes is obviously marriage. Marriage is the consummation of creaturely love. But of course, even this points beyond itself, as it is a sacrament. It is at the height of creaturely love that one gets a glimpse of divine love. Marriage is an icon of love, a sacrament that makes present the love of Christ for his bride, the church. Ratzinger writes, the unity finality and indivisibility of the love between man and woman can, in the last analysis, only be made a reality and understood in the light of the belief in the unity and indivisibility of God. Ultimately, there can be no naturalistic explanation. Thus, arguably, the pathway of the idolatry of the body, in terms of the other sex, can, if logically followed to its end, lead beyond idolatry to God himself. The idol can become an icon. Now, just a little caveat. To be absolutely clear, idolatry is sin. I'm not advocating idolatry. Rather, I'm highlighting that idols and icons are closely related. And we see this often, if we think about that in terms of theology. We think about in the Garden of Eden, what's the promise to Adam and Eve? They shall be like gods. And ironically, it's true. It's just wrong. God's going to make them like gods. It's called deification, right? But he promises it in a twisted, warped way. And so there's something sort of, I think we'll find this lots of examples in which our idols are very close to being right, yet so far away, so far away. The distance often is so vast that the divine width of the cross is needed to transverse from the former to the latter. A similar outward developing movement to the idolatry of the other sex can be seen with the idolatry of one's own body. The more one turns to the mirror, the more one is unsatisfied. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most beautiful of all? The dissatisfaction of vanity pushes one to look beyond the mirror, to look for affirmation from another person. Yet, such idolatry is not as jarring as idolatry of the other sex. With vanity, otherness is not encountered in such an obvious way. Okay, so let me wrap everything up. Idolatry is a curving inward, a denial of otherness. As Ratzinger noted, liturgy, which is concerned with right worship, cannot spring from the imagination, for then worship is born out of the self. We worship idols because we desire a false sense of control, and this desire for control can only come to fruition if the world is mine. Thus, recognition of the other is the first step away from idolatry. The other is that which is both object and subject. The recognition of the body, rather than disembodied individualism, and perceiving the other sex through the body, sex drive, opens the perceiver to the possibility of encountering otherness and can thereby unlock the cage of idolatry. However, in order to open the cage door and to step out and stay out, a second step must be taken, the step of love. Love, to will the good of the other for the other, completes the process. For here, the other aspect of personhood is brought into the equation, the will. Furthermore, it is love that stops that second recognition of the other sex from turning the other sex into an object. When the other is encountered as other, as subject, and not merely object, the other becomes transparent to the glimmerings of the divine. Fagerberg pithily noted, "Our loves can lead us to the Creator when they no longer lead us to ourselves." Great line. This, he argues, is why we need a liturgical posture. And then further down the same page where this quote is from, he writes, "Creation was intended as a theophanous window upon the Creator, but the enemy's smoke and mirrors trick us." So, what I'm all saying here, that's my contention, that the recognition of the otherness of the other sex smashes a few mirrors, possibly causing a domino effect. So perhaps this is where the leap from idolatry to icon can begin. where the spark on the idolatrous altar can be ignited into orthodoxy. Learning to kneel in marital promise is a step toward liturgical kneeling. But marital vows are preceded by a natural attraction and wonder of the other. So, rather than desperately push against the secular idolization of the body, perhaps we simply need to redirect or even drive it further so that it reaches its intended end, glory himself.